Hi, welcome to Get Used to It. I'm Sheila Kuehl, and I put this show together every month so that we can have a conversation primarily about issues that affect the gay and lesbian community for you to share and hopefully join in wherever you're watching this. It's almost impossible for us to talk about anything except what happened on September 11th. And I know that most of us have been talking about this, and I hope we'll continue to. Today we had planned a show, and we're going to do the show, about a 10th anniversary of an issue of an uprising, of a response from the gay and lesbian community in Los Angeles that happened because our former governor, Pete Wilson, decided to veto a bill that would have protected us from discrimination in the workplace. We think there are lessons that we learned and lessons maybe to be learned. And I have three wonderful guests here to talk about this today. First is Torie Osborn, who is the executive director of the Liberty Hill Foundation, which is a wonderful foundation that funds grassroots organizing, change, not charity, as the organization puts it. But 10 years ago, Torie was the executive director of the LA Gay and Lesbian Center. Welcome, Torie. Glad you're here.
Glad to be here.
Our second guest is Phill Wilson, who is the founding director of the African American AIDS Institute and also a very recent recipient of a Ford Foundation grant that only went to 20 leaders in the entire United States, though I understand 3,000 were nominated. A leadership grant. Congratulations, Phill, and thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, and I'm glad to be here.
Glad you're here. Our third guest is Peter Mackler, who is the Southern California Policy Liaison for the California Department of Health Services. But 10 years ago, he was the Southern California Coordinator for National Coming Out Day and has a personal story to tell about that time. But Torie, let's start with you, because you're sort of my favorite historian for stuff in the movement, and especially here. Tell us a little bit about what happened 10 years ago, what this bill was about and what this veto kind of set in motion.
Well, the story is about a gay riot. I mean, we are in a movement that was founded by another gay riot in Greenwich Village a few years earlier. But this story is about the community in Los Angeles, essentially hitting the streets, upward of 50,000 people over 6 or 7 weeks, although every single night for 17 days. In a level of militance that, as one state trooper said to me, had not been seen in the state of California since the Watts riots. Now remember, this was about 6 months before the LA riots of 1992. But here's the context. It was 1991. Governor Wilson was running, had just run and beaten now Senator Dianne Feinstein for governor by a very slim margin, less than 1%, about 110,000 votes, which was arguably, it had been credited to the gay community, to gay Republicans and others who had voted for Wilson as opposed to Feinstein, because he had campaigned very aggressively, saying he would sign the centerpiece of the gay legislative agenda for 15 years in California, which was called AB101, Assembly Bill 101. It was a very simple job equity bill, an anti-workplace discrimination bill that State Assemblyman Terry Friedman had put forward. He had waffled it all. Wilson had said he would sign it. Feinstein, of course, had said he would sign it. Now, and it had been something. It was a son of or daughter of AB101, which Art Agnos had put forward, and there was a whole history, centerpiece of the gay legislative agenda. Very simple. Here's the context. You have, ACT UP meetings. It's the height of the AIDS epidemic. It's the height of the mobilization of the gay and lesbian community. Hundreds and hundreds of people are volunteering, for AIDS organizations, for gay and lesbian organizations. People are writing checks. You have the gay community mobilized as never before.
Even before this, you mean?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, is that in the late 80s, from the mid 80s, when the AIDS epidemic really hit the gay community in Los Angeles as well as elsewhere around the country, you had this community response to AIDS. So you had all the AIDS organizations that had come into being, and you had gay and lesbian activism. You had Queer Nation at its height. You had a group called, in Los Angeles, that was quite influential at the time, called League America. You had literally hundreds of people going to ACT UP meetings, hundreds of people going to Queer Nation. meetings, you had people mobilized. So about 30 days before September 30th, which was the day by which Wilson was supposed to sign or let this bill go, a young AIDS activist, a person with AIDS, PWA, named Rob Roberts, started a hunger strike right smack dab in the middle of West Hollywood. And he was doing a countdown on, and this is an AIDS activist primarily, on this bill. And at the time, I remember sitting in my office at the Gay and Lesbian Center saying, AIDS, job equity, what's the connection? And he did a hunger strike, and when on Sunday afternoon, September 30th, the governor betrayed the gay community, capitulated to the right wing that was lobbying heavily, and vetoed this bill against what he'd said his campaign promised, Rob Roberts and a few AIDS activists who had had a hunger strike basically became the magnet for hundreds of us who went down to the middle of West Hollywood and basically engaged in, you know, traffic, stopping traffic, civil disobedience, and sort of hit the streets. And then that night, over a period of 3 weeks intensively, and then sporadically over several weeks thereafter, there was this intensive, you know, street demonstrations. And as I say, remember I said to you, like, kind of AIDS activism, which I was really engaged in, running the center at the height of the AIDS epidemic, thinking kind of, what's the connection? Well, what it really was the depth of the injury, the indignity that a community that had worked so hard in the face of genocidal neglect by the federal government to build this beautiful and, you know, kind of powerful and desperate but very far-reaching community response to AIDS. All these different organizations, hospices and healthcare centers and social support groups, and a community that had been mobilized, that was losing our friends, that was going to funerals every day, that was, you know, joining arms with being arrested with ACT UP, that suddenly somebody would dare to say that we legally couldn't work.
I don't know what the community means. I mean, there were a number of activists, you know, the people who, like the 6 people that are at every meeting, and then 9 people and a dozen people and whatever. But this was beyond that.
Well, it started with the activists. I mean, that first demonstration, there were maybe 300 of us, and I mean, I was there, and I can tell you it was pretty much the same folks. There were
people calling each other on the phone saying, "Do you know what Pete Wilson did today?"
There was it was already kind of activated because people knew Rob Roberts had been there for 30 days, and he was covered in the paper, and kind of this lone PWA became a moral voice. He was kind of our Gandhi of that moment. And so, the first set of folks that showed up at that little crescent, you know, triangle at Crescent Heights in West Hollywood were largely the activists. Although there were I remember Richard Willard was there, who was the head executive director, the publisher of the Advocate, the editor of the Advocate at the time. It was a little bit more mainstream of a crowd. You know, some of the suits started to join the demonstrations. That first night, maybe you had a few of the kids, young guys from the bars out on the streets, but for the most part, it was the next night and the next night and the next night that the word spread. And you know, being on the streets, for those of us who have done it in different movements, is a very powerful experience. It's a very empowering experience to take public space that isn't yours, you know, to kind of take, whether it's taking over buildings in the student movement of the 60s, to basically feel so strongly that you need to make a moral statement that you basically will break the law. And you know, a few people will always do that. There's a few radicals that will always do that. But the depth of this indignity called to so many more people who had never been on the streets before, and that's really the narrative. That's the centrally powerful narrative of this, was that people, whether they had been the suits and they now came in the streets for the first time, which I think is Peter's story maybe, or whether they were people who had never been anywhere near a demonstration, but just felt moved, pulled like a magnet to where people were just saying no with their bodies, as many other people in other movements had before.
Well, you know, the sense of outrage, it's, again, I said to everybody, let's not stretch too many comparisons here, because we've all been talking about kind of what happened in our personal response to September 11th and our communities are our friends, but one of the things that struck me about one of the many discussions about America's response so far is this feeling of a loss of innocence. And one article that struck me said, how many times can America lose its innocence? You know, every time we're feeling betrayed or something has happened or whatever, we keep thinking, gee, my bubble's been burst again. But it felt as though 10 years ago, there were a lot of us that thought, you know, the government will never do anything good for us, so never mind. But there were more and more that apparently felt, I can't believe this. I worked for Wilson. I voted for him. He said he'd be with us. Did you get a sense that the sort of extended group
the
felt that
shockwaves
betrayed?
expanded the active out participation. I mean, that's the thing, is that people who were coming onto the streets were coming out of the closet. Some, you know, they may have been able to write a check to APLA or even volunteer at APLA without being out of the closet. If you were in the streets committing civil disobedience, putting your body down on the street and blocking traffic, and mind you, these demonstrations were quite extraordinary. They started in West Hollywood. The next night they were in Century City and down in mid-Wilshire. They were at the airport. They almost went out on 405 one night. I have heard stories about. They were in Silver Lake. They were in Beverly Hills, where the chant was, we're here, we're queer, and we're not going shopping. And there was, and this is actually another whole piece of it, is that the transformative power of civil disobedience, of group action, of collective action, shows that from outrage was really forged a kind of a joy and a sense of empowerment. People would go back because it was really a wonderful place to be. The sense of solidarity, the sense of collectivity, the sense of people coming together for a cause greater than their own individual, you know, whatever their experience was. And I think that's the power of direct action. That's the power of demonstrations. It's the particular power of civil disobedience when people are moved far enough to commit it. There's nothing really more empowering. And you know, I think that the shock waves did reach people who were brand new to coming out, brand new to social change, brand new to the gay and lesbian movement. And it was one of those catalytic experiences that I think had impact for, you know, forever on the people who were part of it. Some of them were more cynical than I had been. You know, I've been kind of, you know, doing civil disobedience for a long time, but a lot of other
cheerfully
people,
so too.
Well, not cheerfully necessarily. I mean, but it wasn't new to me.
All I mean is that no one would really characterize you as a cynic generally just because you're a realist. I mean,
no,
those are really different.
But I am sometimes cynical about what tactics are, you know, will resonate with people. I mean, there are a lot of times that I've seen people chain themselves to this and that like it's like been a little blip that's gone nowhere. This was a mass organizing experience and an empowering experience for tens of thousands of people.
Well, Phill, you've been involved in a number of aspects of this movement and other movements. Where were you at this point in your life?
Well, you know, 10 years ago, I was the AIDS coordinator for the city of Los Angeles and a special assistant to Mayor Bradley. The one period of my life where I was a bureaucrat. And I have
a suit, as it were.
Exactly. I have a little different spin on it than Torie. I think that there were a few things that were going on. First of all, I think that Torie's absolutely right, that one of the reasons why this happened is that, quite frankly, I think it was the height of the gay and lesbian activism. I mean, that people were mobilized, they were energized. But the other thing that happened is that because of that activism, and because of, quite frankly, you know, AB101 was the result of a lot of suit work, if you will. You know, the activists and the lobbyists, which is, you know, a lot of the work that I was doing at the time. You know, the suits basically said, we can do this. you know, and
we're going to act within the law and make the law work.
That's right.
For us.
Now, kind of the insider-outsider strategy, and also the message was, in the face of age, you know, this is a part of human dignity. You know, that of course the governor is going to sign. And so when he vetoed it, and I think it's also important that he vetoed it. He didn't do a pocket veto. Now, he could have waited one day and it just would have gone away. I think people would have been angry, but he felt the need to send a message to both sides, you know. And I think what happened in the face of all of the dying and all of the grieving that we were going through, for him to say, we don't matter, you know, created a reaction that caused the events to happen. And also, I think there's a context and relating different movements. I often think about the things that happen within the gay and lesbian movement and compare them to my experience as an African American. And remember, this is basically 6 or 7 months before the Los Angeles uprising that was precipitated by the Rodney King verdicts. And I think that in some ways there was a relationship, because in the Rodney King case, black people felt that we knew that we were being brutalized by the police, but we also knew that if they got caught on camera, where you couldn't deny it, you know, our sense of justice would say, this is wrong and you have to do something. And the gay and lesbian community felt, if we're able to convince our legislators, you know, on both houses, you know, that we deserve, you know, to be able to work, you know, and to have insurance, you know, and to be able to care for our loved ones who are dying. Now, it's a small thing for the state of California to say that you can't be fired just because you're a gay and lesbian person. And for the governor to say, no, you don't count. Now, just like for the jurors in Simi Valley to say, even when we see it, you know, we don't care. You know, I think that was part of the rage. So for me, I think there are multiple things going on. Part of it is that I think a lot, unlike before, a lot of suits, you know, were on the streets. You know, were in the streets because basically it was the suits who were leading the AB101. The relationship between AIDS and the job thing was very clear to me, you know, as a person living with AIDS. It made absolutely sense, you know, what Rob was doing in Santa Monica. You know, that it was about, yes, a lot of us are dying, you know, but we're human beings. You know, and at that point in time, any place where you can you could stake that out to say, I'm a person too, I'm equal to, I count too, you know, was absolutely a big deal for us. You know, and so I think a lot of those things contributed to the magnitude of the response. I think that what was shocking was not so much that the riots happened, but that they didn't expect, you know, queer people to do that. They didn't expect the sissies to do that. No, they didn't expect the faggots to do that. And the fact that gay men and lesbians, you know, basically said that that basically went to the streets. The other part, you know, that people don't talk about a lot, because I think that a lot of these things are kind of is serendipity, that different things coming together at the same time. And there was an incident that actually happened in Santa Monica, and then people filled the streets, and then cars were being blocked, and people were angry about that. And there was an incident where someone called someone a faggot from a car, you know, and that was kind of one of those things that was either an additional spark or it added flame to it, but it was just another reminder that what Pete Wilson was really saying is that there was a group of Californians that were less than other Californians, and at that point in our history, no, we could not take that.
Well, it was interesting to me too, because I think that people put their faith, as I started to say with Torie, I think we are kind of a good community, and any time you'll give us just a little bit of something to hope for, that somebody will actually treat us well, we turn into puppy dogs in many ways.
Well, for years, you know, elected officials or candidates, they just had to show up. They didn't have to vote the right way. All they had to do is show up. No, take a picture.
They just had to not send our checks back.
That's right, exactly.
You know, it's like, please, take my money.
Exactly. So, no, and even I think many of us felt that we were not asking for a lot. No, quite frankly, I don't think that many of us felt that AB 101 was even asking to be equal.
Is there any staying power, though, after all of this happens? You know, we've seen, as Torie said, people have gone out on the street, they've gotten arrested. It's joyful, it's sort of fun for some people, you know, and we have these stories and we save our little plastic handcuffs, you know, for our scrapbooks, etc. And then it's kind of over. Do you see that there was any long-term effect from this in the community or different parts of the community?
I actually disagree with this. I don't think it's ever over. I think that every time people step out, that they can't step all the way back, you know. And I think that it's the little piece that you can't get all the way back in that actually makes a movement run. It's the engine of movements, you know. And so, you know, the person who came out on the streets, and maybe he or she never came out on the streets again, but they were a different person. You know, their vote was different. Their speech was different. No, there's something about a person that's moved. No, when your body and your spirit and your soul says, "I have to take action." You know, and I think, quite frankly, you know, as we kind of look backwards and we look forward, particularly in light of September 11th, now it's going to require a lot of us to kind of look at those experiences and say, what made me move? What was organic in my soul that made me take action? Because I think there are going to be lots of occasions where we're going to need to ask ourselves, you know, what kind of action are we going to take, and what will it say about us?
You know, it's interesting too when you talk about crossing that line, which of course I think is different for every single person. We also, I think, as Americans, want to be obedient in a way. I don't mean just law abiding, but I mean kind of, you know, as good as we can be with very few exceptions. I mean, sometimes activists know no matter what you do, America's not going to totally be with you, so you're going to always be at odds, you know, with the majority. You don't have to be angry, you don't have to give up, but you're just always going to be in that position. But I think for a lot of people that got involved in those weeks, there was, as you said, Torie, a place that you've sort of crossed it. When you go into the street, or you show up, or you get arrested or hurt.
Or you publicly admit that the governor of California doesn't think you count.
But it's hard because you've still got neighbors, and you're still going to have Thanksgiving dinner, you know, where you have to kind of explain what you did. And I think people sometimes feel still a little bit ashamed that they kind of went against regular life and were disobedient.
Well, I think that it would be wonderful if, in fact, we were to get to the place, and I think some people do, where you don't feel shame. But I don't think the feeling of the shame, or having to go through the process of having the nervousness to deal with your action, I don't think that in any way diminishes the power of the action.
Well, that leads us right to you, doesn't it, Peter? I mean, it's one of many, many, many stories that we've been talking about more or less in the abstract, but tell us a little bit of what happened to you, sort of when and what.
Right, well now we do hear from one of the true suits. And taking a line from a few moments ago, I did lose my innocence at that time. And I had become an activist 6 or 7 years prior to Prop 64, 1986, when Lyndon LaRouche had put a initiative on the California ballot to actually quarantine anybody with HIV. I had only come out about a year or so before, had absolutely no sense of community, no sense of belonging. I had just said the words, "I'm gay." I had no idea what that meant. And Prop 64 in 1986 gave me that sense of community. And the way that I empowered myself through the community was as a suit on this side of the street, working in the elected officials' offices, working in the Capitol, working here in City Hall, trying to put different pieces of legislation together that made the most sense for our community, being part of a fundraising movement with Mackler, the Municipal Elections Committee of Los Angeles, which was a powerful PAC. It was a political action committee. And what PACs do is to raise big money and give away big money. Frankly, never had I gone to an ACT UP meeting. And I had enormous respect and admiration for those people who did, but it wasn't me. The suits was where I was empowered. Well, then comes the veto, of course, and certainly watching the maturation of AB101 and also hearing, of course, candidate Wilson and then Governor Wilson saying that he was going to sign it and feeling that same betrayal. You know, one day before the veto, if someone had told me that I would spend the better part of the next 17 nights on the streets in my jeans and my National Coming Out Day sweatshirt or a t-shirt, I would say, you know, you're crazy. If someone had told me that 6 weeks later, on November 15th, I was actually going to get hit by a police officer with a baton on top of my head because I'm part of this demonstration, I would have said, you're crazy. If someone had told me that I would take that action one step further and actually sue the city of Los Angeles, I would say, you're crazy. But come the veto on September 30th, that was where we needed to be at that time. So I would wear my suit during the day and then change it to my
But tell me,
jeans.
you heard about the veto, but how do you bridge from that information and your life at that moment to needing to do something that you hadn't done before?
It was very interesting because that evening I was actually hosting IMRU, a gay and lesbian radio show, on National Coming Out Day, which is celebrated October 11th. So we're here on September 30th. This is just coming up in a couple weeks later, and we get the phone call of the veto and of these folks coming together now at the Triangle on Crescent Heights. And here I am on the radio urging people to get out and to demonstrate and to have our voices heard. I'm urging people now to do something that a day before I can never see myself doing. But it was where we needed to be at that time, and it felt right, just as the suits had felt right going into the Capitol. This was how we needed to be. This was what we needed to do to not sit back and say, it's okay to treat me like that. It was a very natural progression. For me, my own experiences throughout those 6 or 7 weeks, each step that I took, the first time that I did go out on the streets and the radio show, of course, and each demonstration and the subsequent lawsuit, it was an absolute natural progression for me.
Now, did you feel that you wouldn't be attacked by the police? I mean, there's a point at which you think, oh, I'm just going to demonstrate, but they're not going to shoot me. Because they don't do that here. And then things go sour sometimes, and all of a sudden, of course, in many of the circumstances that we've seen, the police attack people who are peacefully demonstrating. Right. But there's that moment of disbelief, isn't there, where you just can't believe they're going to do that?
Oh, absolutely. Throughout those entire 17 days or so, I said, you know, how could they be treating us like this, number one? And number two, maybe this is a bit imperial of me, but I felt that even though I was on the streets as was everybody else, in the same jeans as everybody else, saying, well, that's, you know, don't they know I'm a suit during the day? You know?
I work for the government. Hey.
Right, exactly.
Right.
Don't they know that you know, and I'm here now, but this isn't like, and it was certainly the real me at that time. But absolutely, I felt that I would be barricaded from that.
Now, did you see other? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, and taking your question one step further, the instant that I was struck by the police officers, this was at the Marriott Hotel out in Woodland Hills. That instant when I was falling to the ground and when I was on the ground, there were so many things whirling through my brain. Not to mention probably a couple 100,000 brain cells just getting hit by a police baton. But part of that was also, oh my God, what has happened to me? I was just hit by a police officer. And it was the shame, and it was the guilt, and it was the fear, and it was the, oh my God, how could this be me? This is, you know, this is me falling to the ground. There was an absolute sense of great disbelief. There was also a sense that I would only come to understand about 7 or 8 years later when we actually settled my lawsuit with the city of Los Angeles. There was a sense that this was much bigger than me. That this had absolutely, that the action that had just been perpetrated on me had actually nothing to do with me. But at the same time, I'm also feeling the guilt and the shame and the fear and the pain, and had all of these feelings, just, each one of their own separate importance.
So how did you come to the decision to file a suit? Because that's another big thing. I mean, I was
Sure.
only a lawyer for about 2 seconds in my life, but plaintiffs in these cases, in employment discrimination cases or police brutality cases, it's hard. It's another line that you cross. It's not just going off the curb into the street. You really do make yourself an individual, I won't say target so much as, you're famous. I mean, you have gone another step. How did you come to take that?
It was actually not that difficult for me. As you know, excuse me?
The bruise helped.
The bruise helped. Great evidence. As you said, I was the Southern California coordinator for National Coming Out Day at the time. So all I was doing in the community was supporting people and taking their next step. Mm-hmm. It became so obvious to me that if I hid behind my fear of being public about the brutality, that I would be a hypocrite, and that my next step at that time was to go public and to file a lawsuit. My attorneys, John Davidson and Jenny Pizer over at Lambda Legal Defense and co-counseled by the ACLU, had often used the word brave and courageous in describing myself and my actions about being public about the lawsuit. I knew that I was taking a great risk going out that publicly. I was in business at the time and what have you. I felt anything but brave or courageous. I just felt this was my next step, and this was something I had an obligation to myself to do, and of course I had an obligation to the community at large, both the gay and lesbian and the non-gay community, to make sure that no one else was brutalized by a police officer under the circumstances that I was. And I had a commitment, had an obligation to that.
And the settlement was not just about getting you some bucks either.
No, the settlement was not just about the bucks, was nice, of course, but the settlement also included a few pieces of police reform. The circumstances behind my attack was I had asked a police officer who was pushing a few of us for his badge number and his name. And it's at that time that I saw him lift his baton above his head and come crashing down on me. His badge number was not visible, his name was not visible. And as it turns out, we found out subsequently that there was nothing in the police manual about having your badge number or your name visible, and about actually giving that information to somebody who was asking for it. So as part of our settlement, we mandated that the police reform, the police training manual be changed, which it has been, to say that other than in a tactical riot situation, that whenever a citizen asks a police officer for his or her name or badge number, that they are obligated to give that information. And that came through our lawsuit, and that, to me, brought me back to November 15th, 1991, when I was on the ground. I'm saying, this is so much bigger than me. What is this all about? That answered the question for me. That's what it was about for me.
Well, you've talked, actually, all of you have mentioned the word movement, and we've heard a lot of talk, obviously, recently about whether there is a movement, whether there will be a peace movement, whether there will be what people will decide to do. Do you think there was a growth in the movement here, or the community's agenda or notions of itself after this uprising? Did it make a difference?
I certainly think it made a difference. I mean, one of the things that you, as Peter and Peter responded to that struck me and sadly is an example of where I don't think the community has grown enough is the question of the thing about the police being violent, or did you think that this could happen to you? And Peter said no, he didn't think it happened to him. And the difference, and this is a race question, is I know it could happen to me.
Sure.
And in fact, one of the stories that I tell people that I think is a funny story was the first civil disobedience in Washington when activists were arrested. And David Mixner called me to say, Phill, you should get arrested. We're going to Washington. You should get arrested with us. And we were talking and what have you. And he says, and it's really important now that there'll be some African Americans with us. Now, and I said to David, I said, when you get there, there'll be lots of African Americans with
in jail.
In the DC jail system, you know. But the point is, now as a black person, you know, I'm not surprised when that happened, you know. And one of the things that I think happened somewhat, but not enough, is that I think, you know, gay and lesbian people, particularly gay men, you know, had an experience that a lot of us have regularly, you know, and that's part of understanding, you know, ways to break down the them and us. You know, and that it was an experience where, you know, there's more of us in that experience. And certainly, I think that that's a question that is very timely now, you know, is this whole mentality about the them and us. And one of the things that we're going to struggle with, you know, over the foreseeable future, you know, this kind of, you know, who is the enemy, and how do you fight a war, and who is them, and who is us, and who are we protecting ourselves from?
And also, what do we do? I mean, it's a question of each individual. I know we talk about movement and we talk about community, but what I found is that it's sort of one person at a time made the decision or is making the decision to, you know, to do it. And I hear a lot of people saying today, I don't know what to do. What should I do? Should I donate blood? You know, they said they've got lots of blood. Should I give money? But there's also this sense that there may be some things we're not going to like that the government has done. You know, we liked what the legislature did. They got this bill through, barely. Actually, there's a great story of Senator Leroy Green, a state senator at the time, who was the deciding vote on AB 101 when it came over to the Senate. He had just had surgery and was not supposed to be in the Capitol. And they brought him in. I mean, the story is they brought him in on a stretcher. I have no idea if they brought him. They did. They brought him in on a stretcher, and he was the vote that got that bill back over to the Assembly for concurrence. I mean, that, and probably took a lot of heat for it, but it was that individual kind of decision, you know, and the question is, what do we do? And clearly a lot of people made a decision.
I think part of the confusion about this, I mean, things got much clearer when he vetoed it. The unity, the outpouring, the militants, that wasn't just a few act up folks, but it was tens of thousands of Los Angeles queers, most of whom had not ever been on the streets before. Things became very clear very quickly with that vote. I mean, Rob Roberts was a leader and a moral voice that drew people, but it was very clear. I think part of the challenge now, and we're in the immediate aftermath, even if it's a couple of months after the September 11th tragedy, but is that the stakes are very, very high. And the lessons are, the potential lessons and potential implications are very huge. There's a generation of us that when we hear that you know, I mean, that have a grounding in America's own responsibility in foreign policy that has pissed people off ever since the Second World War and before that, and are also cynical about the government. When I turn on the TV, we're now in the phase where you turn on the TV and biological and chemical warfare are the specter raised by the terrorists, the logical conclusion of the terrorists. Well, I mean, I want to tell you, I'm from a generation that does not believe everything our government tells us, because we remember the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and we remember another war, and you can't compare the wars, believe me, I know this, but there are many, many conflicting things happening. One of the most moving things to me, and when I talked about the joy on the streets, I was talking to somebody who was involved in those street demonstrations that had never been active before and was activated by those demonstrations in West Hollywood and then all of Los Angeles, a different street, a different night, 10 years ago, and he said to me, he said, you know, we don't talk much about the joy because we want it to be kept for history forever as the anger and the righteousness and the moral statement. And he said, but what brought us back night after night was the community, was the sense of being part of something greater than ourselves, and the sense of love. And he said it was anger that got us there. It was love that kept us there. Well, if there is one lesson that I think people are still grappling with how to talk about, because all of a sudden it's a war economy and the domestic agenda is shot and immigration reform is shot and all the issues that any of us care about are not front and center, okay? And we're all trying to figure out, oh my God, what are we going to do about meeting our budgets, and what are we going to do about the people who are going to be more impacted at home, and what are we going to do about the victims? And you know, my partner lost a really good friend on the plane, and she's in primary grief, and on and on. But the thing that is most stunning to me, and I will speak only for myself, is that the universal truth of the power of love was the magnificent message, whether it was everybody on those cell phones, when they knew they were going to be about to die, connecting with people and saying, I love you. I mean, do we all wonder what we're going to do if we're in a similar situation? Well, now we know, because all of them did it, who possibly could. Or whether it was the love where class and race and every other difference in New York City evaporated for an instant as a community was built of extraordinary self-sacrifice and love. We saw the best of America. My mother has never flown an American flag in front of her house, and I said to her, so what's with all these American flags? She says, Torie, I got 2 of them. I said, why? She said, communal mourning and solidarity with a part of America I thought was lost. Now that is good. So if the conversation becomes about democracy and becomes about, you know, if we look at the roots of terrorism and look at the opposite, and as one brilliant writer said, you know, those words, I love you, that came out of people, that is the greatest defense against terrorism. And if our foreign policy starts to not just be about war and power and imposing our economic system, but it is also has another ethic underneath it. Along the line, somewhere along the end of the way, we may see an end to terrorism. And if it doesn't, we won't.
Especially if the discourse is about real democracy.
Exactly.
You know, and not about jingoism, and not about being the same, you know, and about celebrating our diversity. You know, we should be outraged that Barbara Lee got death threats you know, for voting. We should be outraged, you know, and that she was accused of not being patriotic. You know, she was being extremely patriotic. That's what patriotism is about. Now, we should be outraged, you know, that Bill Maher, you know, got challenged because
almost lost his job.
After all the other things he said, you know, that are really creepy and bad.
Because he said that they weren't cowards. And in fact, they weren't cowards, you know. What they did was horrible. It was hateful. It was evil.
They weren't
but
cowards.
It was not cowardice. These are individuals who are willing to die for what they believe. You know?
And I think we have to take that even more seriously than the word, you know, than the word cowardice.
And relative to our community, you know, understanding that we were a part of this. You know, there was a gay man on that flight from Newark. You know, there was a gay man on the roof of the World Trade Tower who was on a cell phone talking to his lover as the building collapsed. You know, one of the stories that was in the Wall Street Journal was about a gay couple who had been together for 25 years, and one of the partners was a security guard, you know, who was killed. You know, and so all of us were there, regardless of race or sexual orientation or creed or religion or any of those issues. You know, it was about us, and where we go from here has to be about us.
And I think we also have to look at the real definition of terrorism and who really are the terrorists. Why are we not taking a stronger stance against Falwell and against Robertson for their comments a few days later saying that they point the finger at feminists, abortionists, the gay and lesbian community who wants to make that lifestyle normal.
And liberals.
Liberals, pagans,
People
the
for
ACLU.
the American way.
People for the American way, you know.
He's made a great coalition for us, actually.
Exactly,
you know?
exactly. And how, you know, how I see them as much of a terrorist as Bin Laden. And why are we not? Exactly. And why are we not?
Well, in a way, we are. I mean, there's a different. Depends on who we is. In a way, it's there. You know, the American people. How do I know what they think? I read the. You know, I listen on the talk shows. I read what they write into the papers. You know, in the letters and so from, you know, such and such a city. They were universally castigating
Right.
that conversation that he had with Pat Robertson. It was kind of a very good thing that it was revealed
It
in
marginalized
terms of
him
what
for the first time in the last
terrorist,
time.
religious terrorist, he is.
All right. Now, Phil just used the word fascist. I remember something, going back now to the conversation about the veto, when Wilson gave a speech at UCLA. It was pouring rain. A couple of hundred of us out there, again in the
Wilson.
Huh?
Adolf Wilson.
Adolf Wilson. And he was calling us, our community, fascists. And, and that hurt a lot of people. My mother also, also may not have a flag on her, or a gay flag actually, at that time, but had written a letter to Pete Wilson, first political letter she had ever written, saying, I am the proud mother of a gay man. How dare you call my son a fascist? So that was her gay patriotism, if you will, 10 years ago, just like, your mother keeping 2 flags up on the house now, and we'll take those fights where we can get them.
There was an article, there've been so many emails that I can't keep them all straight, but there was one that said that, actually Gloria Steinem said that the most revolutionary emotion is empathy. And I really believe that. I feel like, the gay and lesbian community has won every time we've been able to make our case personally, politically, in a way that has inspired empathy. And there was somebody wrote that empathy is the beginning of morality. If you can step outside yourself and step in somebody's shoes, or just have a flash of understanding that it's the beginning of knitting together some kind of ethic or morality. And when we talk about democracy, whether we're talking about democracy at home, I am acutely aware, because most of the work that I'm working on now is on economic and racial justice, and how much the roots of the riots in the April of '92, later on, the LA uprising, are very similar to the roots of what causes terrorism. When you have great, vast, desperate poverty and inequities, and you have America imposing McDonald's in countries where people don't have jobs where they can afford to buy McDonald's, and you have this growing gap between this global economy that is increasing the gap between rich and poor, when you have hatred and bigotry and fanaticism thrive in those conditions. And whether you're looking at intergroup interethnic relations in Los Angeles, or whether you're talking about religious differences internationally in a new global world, we have got to start dealing with these core issues. And I think the gay and lesbian community actually has some things to teach about that. Some of them came alive during our own riot in Los Angeles 10 years ago, but I think our own movement has given us some gifts in terms of learning some of the lessons that need to be taken out into the world. And suddenly it's ratcheted up to a global level, but I think we would do well to examine our own kind of, our own lessons, hard fought and hard won, about building community and
the question
bridging
about
difference.
What each individual does, though, when you were talking about Barbara Lee, and I was also thinking about each individual person saying, I'm leaving my house and going out to the street. It isn't the kind of thing that you could say, oh, gee, there's a big group, I'm doing it as a group. It's an individual thing, and democracy is the most interesting intersection of the individual decision and the collective result. Barbara Lee and I served in the assembly together. She was already there when I came in. And one of the things that she and a few others taught me right away is you just have your vote. It's a big thing, but you can talk to other people, you can try to persuade them, you have your own bills, but when you get right down to it, what the people sent you up there to do is you have your own individual vote. That's all.
But you will be moved to vote in different ways, only insofar as you feel connected to some purpose that is greater than your individualism.
But she thought she wouldn't be the only one. That was the interesting thing to me. And yet, because she was the only one, she's both singled out for praise, appropriately so, and singled out for, you know, castigation.
But at least she opened up the space. At least somebody
the whole
claimed that
dialogue
space.
is because of her.
Right.
You know, I mean, so the importance, I'm not saying in isolation, never. But it becomes a collective act. And I guess I've been saying to people, don't wait to find out what the group wants you to do.
Right.
You know, follow your heart, but when you get out to the street, you'll be absolutely amazed. There's thousands of people
And that's the
out there.
challenge for this community right now, actually.
Right.
No, because I think that there are some of us who perceive that as a community we have something to lose. Now, and so a line is going to be drawn. Now, and some folks are going to be on one side of the line, and some folks are going to be on the other side of the line. And as a community, I think that some of us feel that we now have something to lose. I think that one of the things that was powerful around AB101 that helped make it happen is I don't know if we thought that we had anything to lose, and then those of us who thought that we did realized that we didn't. You know, and so that pissed them off. But I think that now there are a lot of us who do think that we have something to lose, and so I think that there's a lot of political calculus now that makes it difficult for folks to in fact follow their heart, you know, and in fact be able to build empathy through that morality, because it is the empathy, the morality that happens through empathy happens because we are true, because we step out, we vote the right way, not thinking that we're going to be the only one but voting because that's what we believe. Now, we go out to the streets of Santa Monica because we're moved to do it. And in fact, we are surprised that there are people out there also. And that's the power, you know, because there's that connection. When you get there, you say, oh, you're there too, you know, and that's the power.
One other way that we could affect some change, because one place that we won't see our gay brothers is at the Red Cross. As gay men, we're not allowed to give blood. Still to this day, you know, 20 years into the AIDS epidemic, and you know, 15 years into testing, and know how to isolate the HIV, and we still cannot give blood as gay men. So, and yet we have our brothers and our non-gay brothers and sisters standing on lines to give blood as their contribution to this relief, and again, we are excluded.
Well, it's interesting. I actually heard an African-American young man say, well, at least I won't be racially profiled for a while. And I was thinking about this thing about, you know, gay men can't give, right, Arab Americans are going to experience racial profiling, and maybe the black community will get a break for a while, you know? It's like, but there is this way in which at some point, and I feel as if it's possible that there could be this new patriotism that has an empathy for the world, you know? I saw, driving actually to do this show, I saw a car that had a heart, like I Heart New York, but just a heart, and an American flag, and then a peace symbol. And I thought, yeah, they're going for something here. You know, love is the best thing that we've seen. I mean, nobody has talked about it in those terms, and it sounds simple and corny, but the bottom line is the power of love
But this is
the only thing that can fight, hey, do we know this better than anybody else or what?
That's one of the things I remember, actually all of us at different times talking to each other about this, about how in a way, we have been, you know,
an army of lovers cannot fail. Remember that one?
Hit by the police, and we've been discriminated against, and all this stuff. And frankly, what we have to teach here, all we're about is who we love. I mean,
but
that's
at some
really
point,
what led to the
if you're
whole thing.
willing to say it's not about what I lose. If I give up a little bit, and then they give up a little bit, and somebody else gives, and if it's in a spirit of kind of sacrifice, and I don't know, I think we're going to be seeing a new movement. It's not just going to be a teach-in about Central Asia. We're all going to learn more about Afghanistan than we ever thought we would know, and that's a good thing. Teach-ins are a good thing. It's always good. Knowledge is good. But ultimately, this is going to be some sort of revolution of values and of the heart. And I think that the gay and lesbian community has a lot to say about that.
Well, and we've
a lot
also
to give
taught
to
that love is not a naive thing. You know, how they go, oh, peace, love, joy, like it has no connection to the real world.
Right.
Nothing could be further from the truth, because we learned that love is a very powerful, real world approach, not just naivete.
And that you pay for it every day.
Pay for it.
Every day.
Say more.
Now, what we know is that now being willing to love whom we love is not a one-time occurrence. You know, that every day when you decide I'm going to hold my boyfriend's hand or hold my girlfriend's hand or put that photograph on my desk or not play games with pronouns, now every day you have to reaffirm your love. And the same thing, I think, around whatever movement that's going to happen out of us. Every day, we need to reaffirm our democracy. We need to reaffirm that the foundation of our society is based on love. And it's not something that's going to be short or quick or easy, and that's okay.
And that is a perfect ending to this show. We've come to the last minute of the show. I want to thank the three of you so much. It's always wonderful to have you on the show. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. I can't even leave you with a meaningful message because I couldn't sum up everything we're all feeling in one sentence. So I guess just echoing what we've been saying here at the end, think about the power of love in all of this, the practicality of it, the basic power of it, and I hope we can all get used to it.